Thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm not quite sure who you are. I was told that you are philologists who work on either one or another or yet another language. So you either work on whatever French or German or Spanish or whatever language you happen to like. Okay. What I want to talk to you about now is to make a plea for widening the perspective. I want to talk about the fact that it's good to be a philologist in language A, B, or C, or whatever, but at the same time, it will be beneficial to think outside the box of your particular language or particular philology and look what is across the fence, what the people in the corridor, the guy down the corridor knows about some other language, or people know about general linguistic typology. And I think it will be it's beneficial for people who work in philologies, in historical linguistics of any language, to find out what people are doing in other languages. Because the only language I happen to know something about is German. Most of my examples will be from German, but I hope that the methodological point I'm trying to make, and say the general theoretical point, could be relevant for any type of language you study. It just happens to be my examples of German. I'm going to use mostly examples from my own work, because it's the only work I'm confident I know about. I think I've understood my own paper, so I'm going to talk about those mostly. But the idea is that this should be hopefully applicable to any kind of philology you do. Now, traditionally, philology has always been a comparative field, at least in, say, what they call the comparative historical reconstruction type of Indo-European studies, lately. So that's something that has been done for about 200 years. But what people did is they looked at the synchronic stages of grammars and looked at this and this and this and that language in order to reconstruct something that had happened before that. So that's the whole idea of comparative historical linguistics, to reconstruct Indo-European a pre-state by comparing synchronic pieces of information. At the same time, there's always been a strand in historical linguistics in, say, the national and the nationalistic philologies. Again, something that founded out in the 19th century. You study the philology of X because you like X. And therefore, this was the old political idea of the 19th century, all this nationalistic stuff, and you're interested in this language and this culture because this is particularly good culture, and therefore you study this, and that's it. This type of national philology in some countries still has lots of repercussions. For instance, say, take the German-speaking countries even today, or say, take France. Most people who work in linguistics do not work in the linguistics department, but work in the philological department. So most of us are defined by, I'm a germanist, you are an Anglicist, you are a French scholar, or whatever. This is in university organization, but this is also in academic communication. For instance, if you go to the International Conference of Historical Linguistics, which is about every 2 years, people from all over the world gather to study historical linguistics, but few of the people who go there are from, say, traditional philological departments. So people who work in philology usually don't go to this type of international meeting where people from all over meet. And you might be an exception of being here in this room with me, but this is not what's usually being done. And I don't think this is a very good idea. And my paper is, I want to show you, to try to give you examples why I think it would be better to do it differently. Because lots of people do single language diachrony, but very few people study one diachrony and another diachrony and not use languages to a comparison to reconstruct prehistory, but to look at this diachrony and at that diachrony and compare those. I think this comparison of diachrony is a very beneficial thing to do. And it's good to do that because it's fun to do it, and it can be helpful for linguistic theorizing. Now, I'm going to take two different perspectives. First, I'm going to talk about fields of historical German linguistics and see how this can somehow be informed by findings from general linguistics, and then I turn the perspective around and see what people who work in a single philology can contribute to general theoretical linguistics and linguistic typology. Now, what do people working in the philology normally do? Say, if you're a Germanicist, your research question is something like, how is German? Or if you're a historical Germanicist, just ask, how was German? Then, if you do historical linguistics, you only study how was it, but also how did it change? And if you are a very ambitious philologist, you also ask the question of, why did it change? But a question that is rarely being asked is this interesting? Now, you found a change, and you have got a reason, but is this an interesting change? Is this an interesting reason you're offering? Is your argumentation interesting or not? I think this last question is a question that people rarely ask, but a question of why it should be interesting should actually be an important question in academic research. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples and you see what I mean. Take, for instance, first example, polite pronouns. Middle English, as well as older French, modern Russian, medieval German had two pronouns, a T pronoun and a V pronoun, and the V pronoun, the second person plural pronoun, is used in polite address. If you want to be polite, you say the second person plural pronoun. Now, why is that so? The reason you can read in many traditional linguistic histories is a very simple one, namely that in late antiquity, in the 4th century, there was a split, a political event in the Roman Empire, so that they had two Roman emperors. One was resided in Rome and the other in Constantinople. And the idea was that whenever you write or you speak to the guy in Rome, you somehow conceptualize the other one as well. So you do not say du, but you say vos, because I'm not speaking to you, but I'm speaking to you and the other one. So that's why I'm using the second person plural as a polite form of address in late antique Rome, and from there it goes into French, and then the French took it, so that the Germans took it from the French in the Middle Ages, and that's how it got into German. Now the same story holds for, say, take an example from this country. Say, for instance, it's been described for lesbian, a Dagestanian language in the Caucasus. They use the second person plural pronoun. Why? Because they were in contact with the Russians, and the Russians in the 18th century took this type of second person plural pronoun from the French, and the French go back to the old Roman emperors. So it's all a chain of contact situations. Good. That's what you read in many traditional stories. However, the fact that you use a second person plural pronoun as a polite pronoun is very, very widespread. And depending on how you want to count, this is about half or maybe a third of the languages of the world. So all across the world there are about, say, a third of the languages that use this particular strategy. Now, can you all trace all those cultures across the globe, can you all trace them back to somehow contact situations that refer back to the late antique Roman emperors? So would you want to say there was a political event 1600 years ago which influenced globally about a third of the languages? Well, that's one way of doing it. An alternative explanation would be to say there are something like universals of polite behavior. And this is something that happens quite often. When I want to ask you something, I do not say, you go and open the window. It's quite impolite. What I'm doing is, it's better to say something like, oh, somebody here might want to open the window, it's rather hot in here, or kind of vagueness that I'm using. And that's been described across the world, that people use subjunctives, passives, various ways to de-individualize addressees in certain speech acts. So if you do not say thou, you as an individual, but if you say ye, in the plural, I'm de-individualizing my addressee, and that's polite. And this happens across the world. And with this type of psychological type of explanation, you do not need the Roman emperors anymore. And because I know that lots and lots of languages across the world behave like that, my psychological story becomes more plausible than the Roman emperor story. So that would be one example where looking across the fence might actually be helpful in finding better types of explanations. A second explanation, a second phenomenon I'm going to skip. It's on the handout. I'll say only 3 sentences about it. German had a second-person plural pronoun in the Middle Ages. Later they developed third-person singular and later third-person plural pronouns as polite forms of address. The famous German he and she in a polite address. And later, what we have today, this German sie, which looks like a third-person plural pronoun. How did this come about? Well, the traditional story, and one that I've actually published a book about 10 years ago, goes that it's got to do with anaphors. You cannot say something like, would the gentleman like to have some tea? And then to say, would the gentleman like to have some tea? Would the gentleman also take some sugar? Would the gentleman now would like to have a spoon? It's very cumbersome to use the gentleman all the time. So that's how, through an anaphoric taking up of the gentleman by he, you get the third-person plural, the third-person singular pronoun into the addressee system. So that's the traditional story. It's a story that I've been telling about for many years until I studied Afrikaans. A closely related Germanic language spoken in South Africa today. I think it's on page 3 and 4 of your handout, example 6a and 6b, where you can see Afrikaans polite address. What they use even today, they use nominal forms. So they use the words like it sees in 6a, the words for uncle, aunt, grandmother, priest, nouns are being used in polite address. And the point about Afrikaans is they do not anaphorize. In Afrikaans, they use the polite noun consistently throughout the discourse when they're speaking polite. So they can either use the familiar form, but if they want to be polite, they use a polite noun throughout. They never use anaphors. So the story that it's cumbersome to say, would the gentleman this and the gentleman that and the gentleman that's cumbersome to anaphorize that. This type of story does not hold for Afrikaans. So the explanation to say that this has got something to do with something like processing ease or stuff like that is probably not completely valid, and it becomes a bit less convincing if you look at a language like Afrikaans, where they do not do that. I mean, they are as effective in their linguistic processing as we are, so that can't be the story behind that. Now, move on to another type of phenomenon. Let's look at something that many of us who teach historical linguistics will probably do when they teach about the causation of linguistic forms. So you think about the different levels of grammar, phonology, morphology, syntax. Traditionally, we would say that one type of change feeds into another type of change. So the idea would be that there is something like phonological change. This somehow leads to problems in the morphology. Morphology, something happens, and then later on, syntax changes because of that. Classic example would be in Romance languages, the Latin case system broke down because of phonological changes. So you don't see the cases anymore. So what they do in modern, say, one of French, for instance, they introduce prepositional phrases, or they word order becomes more rigid because you can't see it in the case endings anymore. So you have to be stricter in your word order. So the idea is that phonology feeds into morphology, feeds into syntax. I'll give you a German example for this, and then you'll see what I think about it. A classic German case would be what they call the South German preterite loss. So in contemporary German, in the southern part of Germany and Austria and Switzerland, people do not use past tense forms anymore when they speak about the past. In speaking, different than writing. In speaking, they only use the perfect. Now, why is that so? Traditional grammars traditional stories will tell you that Middle High German weak verbs were affected by all kinds of phonological losses. The present past tense distinction was lost. So there was syncope and apocope, and all of a sudden, say in Middle High German, you have a distinction between a subject, present, and a subject, plural, past. Now, if you have apocope, a subject becomes to a subject, and all of a sudden you have a present, which is gesagt, and a past, which is gesagt. So homophony. Now, why is that so? Because there is final syllable weakening because of the fixation of German stress, a phonological story, which leads to a morphological non-distinction, which then leads to syntax somehow remedying that by inventing a new type of past tense, thinking about a new way of speaking about the past, namely by using the perfect. Now, first of all, is the chronology okay? Is the perfect invented because the past tense is not distinguished anymore? I mean, one thing, the question is it good in terms of time scales that are involved? The other question is it a good and interesting and arguable story? Because you can either call this the German or the Southern German loss of the preterite. You can also call this the pan-European spread of the perfect. And all of a sudden it becomes a completely different story. It's not that the preterite is lost and the perfect steps in, but now maybe it's the perfect spread and the usage of the perfect spread, and the past tense is ousted, and you don't have the past tense anymore. And this is a pan-European phenomenon. You can see, people have described it, and it starts in Paris and moves eastwards in waves. I'm not sure if it's really Paris and then it moves eastwards, but if there's some west-east spread of this spread of perfect in the last maybe 800 years in European linguistic history. Second example would be what gender theorists will call the pro-drop parameter. They do have a obligatory subject pronoun. The one in our language is like, say, Italian, Spanish, Russian, where you can leave out the subject pronoun in a declarative clause if you don't like it. On the other hand, our languages like, say, Swedish or Danish, where you always have to set one, and then there's a change from one to the other, one type of language to the other. In, for instance, German. German used to be more like Spanish and Russian in the early Middle Ages, and now it's more like Swedish. So why did the pronoun become obligatory? Again, the traditional story tells you, remember, final syllables are weakening, all grammatical distinctions in the verbs are not so easy to distinguish anymore, so you need to give a pronoun to make sure who is speaking and who you are speaking about. In order to make sure about the subject, you need to have the subject pronoun, because the verb ending doesn't tell you anymore what the subject of the actual clause is. So again, there is a partial loss of distinctiveness in the verbal endings, which leads to the obligatory setting of pronouns. Now, German is not the only language where this type of change happened, and it's recently been described as the subject agreement cycle. You can find this all over the world, this type of changes. It's not always easy to say why the phonological trigger would actually be. But nonetheless, and the same has been studied in Romance linguistics, and there's on page 5, Adam Ledger's a reference to Adam Ledger's work where he lists dozens of papers discussing this particular point, and the basic question is always the same one. It can either be that there is phonological erosion, which leads to some kind of compensation by syntactic means. You don't see the preterite part, the preterite present distinction anymore, so you need to use lots of perfects. You don't see the verbal endings anymore, so you need to use pronouns. So this is compensation by syntax because of some phonological problem. But you could also turn the whole thing around and say maybe it's functionally motivated, and there was something like expressive strengthening. So you do set the pronoun because you want to emphasize it, and then you use it occasionally, and because you use the pronoun, you are free to mumble with your ending. You don't need to distinguish your ending so much because you hear it in the pronoun anyway. You want to use the perfect for expressive reasons to make it more immediate, your discourse, and to be more in spoken line immediacy in the discourse. So you use the perfect, and then you can, and so therefore you don't need the past tense so often, so you can actually afford to mumble and to use apocryphes in the past tense, because past tense definition is not relevant anymore. Anyway, so now which are two options? As I said, it's been discussed extensively in Romance linguistics, not so much in Germanic. Which of those two options is the correct one? Well, I don't know. One way to check that is go through the chronology. The other is if you look not at one language but at several languages, and you realize for this and for this language, the phonological erosion story, for instance, fixation of stress in German is a good story, but fair enough. But you look at another language which did not have fixation of stress, which did not have phonological erosion, but still also invented subject pronouns. The phonological story is less interesting anymore, and you need to find some other, maybe functional explanation for the same phenomenon. Last example where, now again moving to a completely different area, last example of something happening in German at the moment. It's a phenomenon that's called Kiezdeutsch. It's a variety of German that is emerging right now. I would say a new dialect of German. Some people will call this Turkish German slang, or there are various expressions for that. The idea is that this is a type of language that looks, for instance, like on example 10. Those people would not say, morgen gehe ich zur Schule, tomorrow go I to school. Rather, they say, morgen ich die Schule. So you see a change in word order, and also you see a loss of the preposition. Now, and a lot of other linguistic phenomena that can be found in this particular type of variety of German. Now, there are various factors that come into play here. One is it's a spoken language, spoken youth language. So there are universals of spoken language usage that are used, we can see in this type of variety, of this new dialect. But it's a language that is not being spoken by just anybody in Germany, but it's a dialect that emerges in urban, multicultural, multilingual settings in big cities. So it's a youth language in certain multicultural areas of Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Mannheim, but you do not live these in traditional villages, monolingual villages. So there is the factor of second language acquisition of the adult generation of those, the parent generation of those speakers that comes into play. Most of these people who speak Deutsch are multilingual youths living in those multicultural areas, where lots of people meet from different cultures. So this might be a factor, and also there are inherent tendencies in German grammar that might play a role here. Now, the interesting fact is that this phenomenon of, say, Kiezdeutsch formation, similar phenomena occur across many industrialized urban areas in Western Europe. You find the same has been described for Dutch in Antwerp and Rotterdam, as well as for Danish in Copenhagen, as well as for varieties of Swedish in the suburbs of Stockholm. Not so much in England, by the way, because multicultural London because London is very different in terms of its ethnic setup, so maybe something special happened there. But for most continental West European urban centers, similar phenomena of new dialects emerging have been described very recently. Now, all those different areas I just mentioned, suburbs of Stockholm, of Copenhagen, areas in Antwerp, in Rotterdam, they all have similar social linguistic settings. It's all got to do with a certain type of migration and post-migration setup of people living there, and have all had similar socioeconomic status, relatively poor, relatively uneducated people living in these communities. And the languages involved, the contact languages, are all very similar. Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish. So that's the type of languages that are in contact there. Now, one thing that has come to my my attention only very recently, and I can't tell you anything about the outcome because we've just started the project, and the first paper will be written in about 3 weeks. The question is, what happens in another content situation with a very different social linguistic setting? And the one we're looking at is what we call non-Deutsch, the youth language emerging in Namibia today. You might know that Namibia has a sizable German-speaking population. It used to be an German colony, and when you speak to, say, a Namibian newspaper, it's just normal German. It's nothing spectacular. When you speak to educated adult people there, they speak just Northern German tinged standard German, nothing interesting. Now you go to a youth club in Namibia and you listen to the hip-hoppers talking there, and they sound completely different. They speak German, and they speak a new variety of German. They speak non-Deutsch, what we call it non-Deutsch or non-slang, which is a different type of new dialect of German, and nobody up to now, nobody knows what it really is and how it works, because nobody's ever studied it, and we've just done our first bit of fieldwork to get our first data. And if you ask me in a couple of weeks, I can tell you the first pieces where this might be what's happening there. The interesting fact from the point of view of linguistics is the social linguistic setting is different, because there these are not the lower class, low socioeconomic income, less educated, because these are the ones who are in the know, these are the ones who have the economic power in Namibia. So the social linguistics is different. And of course the contact languages are different. There's no Turkish or Arabic contact there, but the contact is with English Afrikaans. So this well, certainly from what we see, this does have influence on the type of new varieties that is emerging. However, as I said, wait for another couple of weeks, I'll tell you more. Just wanted to tell you about this today to show you that if you don't only play around with different languages, but also with different social linguistic settings of one particular language, you might get different laboratory situations of language change, language variation, language change, that might be interesting to look at. So, this was my last example where I talked about, say, German philology and how this might be informed by looking across the fence, what's happening in other languages. Now, turn this perspective around. Why are we important for general linguistics? I mean, it's not that we import their ideas and look at what they're doing and then we take them, but also the other way around. We have something to offer as philologists, which they need. General linguistics needs data, and we got them. We got them more than they would normally have them, because necessarily general linguistics must be crude and superficial. If you study linguistic typology and you study 15 or 20 or 25 or 50 or 100, 500 languages, you must be crude. You can't be very detailed. But we are the ones who have the details, and we have the chance of looking at languages in historical depth, because you have lots of historical data and we know our languages. We can use this to help our friends in general linguistic typology to improve their modeling. And again, I'll give you a couple of examples. A very simple one is with the famous agreement hierarchy, where you have, say, in second language like German, you have those hybrid nouns, where I take a noun like das Mädchen is grammatically neuter, but it refers to people who would consider themselves female mostly, and therefore naturally the semantic agreement would be something like with feminine, but the noun Mädchen is neuter, so there's a mismatch between the grammatical gender neuter and the semantic gender, if you like, feminine. Now, if something like this happens, and this has been described actually by a statistist, Graf Corbett, different targets in the clause behave differently with regard to how they agree with those two types of gender that there are. Just to cut a long story short, there is this nice cross-linguistic agreement hierarchy, which my colleague Jörg Fleischer has actually looked at from a diachronic point of view of German. You can see this on page 6 on the handout there. Different texts in German linguistic history behave differently with regard to how they agree on this hierarchy. But the changes that occur from Old High German to Contemporary German are not random, but they move along hierarchy. Moves a bit to the right and a bit to the left. The point is, the hierarchy, the synchronic hierarchy graph only ever works of synchronic data, and it came up with the hierarchy by looking at a survey of Slavic languages. The synchronic hierarchy exactly matches the diachronic developments. So this is like, it depends on what type of linguist you are. You can either be very excited now and say, okay, we as philologists have proven Graf Corbett's synchronic analysis, and this can be either very exciting, or you can say, okay, yeah, just another confirmation of an old hypothesis. It depends on your type of person that you are. You find this exciting or not, but at least it's nice and gratifying to say that we can confirm what other people have found out. More interesting maybe are things that are new to typologists, and it's on page 7 and 8. Remember those German points of address? I told you that they have the third person singular pronoun, the third person plural pronoun. There's a long story about what happened in German. It was a point about 200 years ago when German had a polite pronoun that has never been described in the typological literature. They used a form, the form was dieselben, so themselves. A certain form of identity pronoun that was used as a polite form, and on page 7 you see an excerpt from a letter where I've underlined all the addressee-related forms, and you see all kinds of forms there, all kinds of polite ways of doing it, and there's one pronoun, I mean there's dieselben, which does never show up in the typological literature, and which I could never have found out about by studying contemporary language states and looking at various languages. The only way to do that is to look at late 18th and early 19th century texts. The reason is, this was a very unstable phenomenon. This is something that only happened for about 50 years. They used this particular polite strategy, and then they did away with it again for various reasons. The point is, you need to study texts in order to find those rare phenomena, otherwise you just would overlook them. I'll give you a second example for exactly the same kind of thing. How do you answer a polar question, a yes-no question? How do you answer that? Some languages use an echo strategy, like for instance on 13, in Latin, if you ask, do you hear? The answer is, I hear. They do not have a word for yes or no. They have to repeat the focused element, mostly the verb. Now, other languages like, say, German, Dutch, Russian, they will not use echo forms, but they use a particle, namely yes or no or whatever. Now, Middle High German had yet another strategy, namely they combined both. You can see this on 14, where somebody asks, is your name Lunette? And the answer is, yes, sir, yes, I. So this is, what you have here is a yes-no particle plus a personal pronoun. And the personal pronoun changes according to the person number specification in the question. So here you have a combination of a particle on the one hand and an echo form on the other hand. This is very unrare. This has been described for contemporary Southern Dutch dialect, and the person who did that said, this is the only language I know where this happens anywhere. It's only in the Flemish dialects, nowhere else in the world. Now, you study Old French and you find it. You study Middle High German, you also find it. It's just that it's only in certain texts, and they're relatively infrequently, and you do find those forms, but they're not terribly widespread back then, and it's somewhat unclear what they actually mean. Again, another thing I'm investigating right at the moment to find out what the exact pragmatics of this form is. The point for me today now just is, if you do more than just looking superficially at a couple of contemporary grammars, but if you're a philologist and look at all the texts, you find things that would have been overlooked otherwise. Now, to go to my very last example before I then have some conclusions. If we look at languages across the world, you will find many things that are very common. I mentioned, for instance, the second person plural pronouns, a polite pronoun, that's very common. Then there were other things where on a worldwide scale, German, Dutch and French are very uncommon. There are certain things where German, Dutch and French are very, very strange when you look at them from a global perspective. This is what has been described as so-called standard Irish European Sprachbund phenomenon. So those languages, German, Dutch and French, seem to be very, very strange from a global perspective. Just to give you one example how this works. What people did is they looked at the WALS Atlas, the World Atlas of Language Structures, looked at what's happening there. So their languages are coded to their typical strategies. Just to give you one example how this works. They asked, for instance, how do you form your yes-no questions? How do you form a yes-no question? I mean, there are various ways of doing this. A couple of examples are on example 16 and following. You can either use a rather strange English expression with a to-do periphrasis, which again is relatively rare. What happens much more often is something like you have in Russian, 17, where you have on the one hand a declarative clause, and if you want to form a question out of that, you just change intonation. That's not, you know better Russian than I do, but I was told that intonation is the main way to form a question. The other form is to use a particle, the lead particle, which you put somewhere into your clause to indicate this is the question. And this lead particle is the same what happens, for instance, in lots of languages across the world. Take Mandarin 18 is Mandarin Chinese. We have exactly the same story, a declarative clause, and it's exactly the same, everything the same. The only thing you change is another particle, and it makes an interrogative clause. This is how it's normally done, either by intonation or by particles. What is never being done, except for German, Dutch, Christian, some very few languages, is by changing the word order. Changing the word order is something that does not happen in interrogative clause formation worldwide, except for very, very few languages. All the languages that have been described that do it like Germans are the ones that are black on the map on page 10 on the top. These are all the languages, the black ones are the languages that do it like Germans, all the others do it like either the Russians or the Chinese. So on page 10 on the bottom, you see the 10 most rare characteristics of standard Irish European languages. So some things are very uncommon on the global scale among those Northwest European languages, and these are the top 10 of those strange features. Now, what I did is I had a look at all those strange features that have been described in the literature, and it's about 20, 23, 24 features that have been said to be peculiar to Northwest European, but are very rare elsewhere. I just gave you a list of those 10, and I looked at everything else that's been in literature, about 23 examples, and I looked at, now, these are contemporary standard languages that people look in the WALS data. Now, I looked at older German, at German dialects, and again at Afrikaans, South African Germanic language. So, how do those languages behave? Bavarian as a dialect, Middle High German, an older variety of German, and a standard language in South Africa behave with regard to those features. And the interesting thing to find out is that Bavarian as well as Middle High German are relatively standard average European-like, are strange, whereas Afrikaans is much more regular, much more normal from a global perspective. Now, why is this interesting? The interesting fact is, now, people have asked, why are European languages so strange? And what the main reason that people have come up with, they said they are strange because they are standard languages. If you look at languages across the world, it looks like any funny languages anywhere in the world. They are normally, they don't have a written tradition, they don't have a normativity tradition, they don't have schools in those languages, they don't have certain types of norm setters. Nonetheless, so that's why they behave like this, but German and French and Dutch have strong linguistic academies, they have the Académie Française and all that, so that's why they are so special, those European languages. Now, if you look at Bavarian does not have an academy, does not have school teachers, does not have written tradition, but still it behaves strange. The same holds for Middle High German. So it cannot be the story of normativity and prescription that's there. There must be something else. So this is what we as philologists can help, can give to our colleagues in general linguistic typology, to say that certain types of argumentation having to do with, for instance, prescriptivism and normativity do not play such a big role as one might expect. There must be something deeper going on there, again, something we don't know yet. So to sum up the whole story, what are the benefits? As germanicists, we can avoid, or philologists, we can avoid parochialism. My local explanation of those two emperors and the polite pronouns is less convincing if you know that the phenomenon is very widespread across the world. Also, I can avoid overgeneralization. My story about third-person singular pronouns and how they emerge through anaphors, again, is somewhat less convincing if you know that in Afrikaans they do it differently. So all of a sudden it becomes less convincing. I can identify rare phenomena. As a philologist, I know things that typologists don't know, because I know the text and I find funny things in texts that are normally overlooked in the examples. And I can have alternative histories. I can say, okay, this is your German story, but I'll look at the French story. The French story looks different, so there's an alternative history there. So whatever you're saying about this must also take into account that. And so by looking at the other language, we as germanicists can avoid to fall into the trap of parochialism. Now, the other way around, if you have interest, as a germanicist, I can point to interesting phenomena and say, look, that's something interesting happening in my language. And I have philological variations data. I know a lot about dialects, about social linguistics, about textual traditions that typological linguists normally cannot have, and they don't know these things about their languages. So here I can feed data into a general discussion. And I have the social cultural background information from many of my languages. I know something about the social linguistic and social cultural setting that I can use in order to feed that again into those grammatical descriptions. So studying German or any other individual language is actually quite helpful if you want to understand language. But if you want to have a deeper understanding, it's a good idea to talk and to listen to people from down the corridor who work on other languages. Because I think, and that's my very last point, we are all organized by bureaucrats who like boxes. But it's nice to have us in nice little departments and compartments. But we as linguists, we don't need those boxes. And it would be a good idea to do away with them and to just work without the box in a more fluid environment. I think that's the last thing I wanted to say to you. I was told that I can speak till exactly 1 minute to go, but now I'm done anyway, so that's where it is. Thank you.